Hello, lovely cherubs. Today we talked about central idea, which is what you learned about last week with Mrs. Tosh, and we are just focusing on it again here. So let's start with a quick review of what central idea is, and then we'll talk through an article and help to practice the skill of just identifying what's the central idea of a text. So some questions you should be able to answer after last week's lesson. First question you should all be able to answer is, what is a central idea? And a central idea is basically a statement of the overarching message of a text. One of the students in class today did a really good job of defining it, and they said it's what the author most wants you to know by the time you get to the end of the text. And that's a really good way to say it. And you should be able to say the central idea in just a sentence or two. So it shouldn't be super, super long and wordy. Just be something sort of simple that says this is what's the main point of the text. Question 2 says, should a central idea contain many specific details? Why or why not? The answer to that question is no, it shouldn't contain a lot of specific details. Details are important and they help us, they give evidence for the information we're sharing, but in a central idea, you're not worrying about those little details. You're worrying about the big picture. What's the big message? So a central idea statement that has too many specific details can get kind of hard to follow and a little bit convoluted, so we don't want that. Last of all, what parts of a text might provide us with clues about the central idea? And I know Mrs. Tosh talked a lot about this last week. Basically, I'm asking you to think about when you first open up a text and you're trying to figure out what's this text most importantly about. And before you even begin to read, there are some things you can look for to give you some clues. So one simple place to find a clue is in the title of the text. Sometimes the text is titled something that gives you a really good idea of what it's going to be about. You also can look at things like subtitles, like subheadings within the story or within the article. You can also look at pictures and captions. You might look at bolded words if there are those. And then some texts, especially in Common Lit, you'll see some texts have a little italicized section at the very beginning that kind of gives you an explanation of what the text is going to be about. That can be a great place to find a central idea. In fact, sometimes it's almost directly stated there for you. So not every article has one of those, but sometimes you get lucky and you see those. So that's all stuff that you should have kind of accomplished and learned last week, and hopefully you were able to practice it in the assignments. Now, something I want you to think about is kind of a little bit of a mind-blowing concept, and this is kind of a little bit about how our previous units relate. So the central idea of an informational text is very similar to something we've talked about that a fictional text has, and that thing is, wait for it, I'll wait for a second for you to think about it. It is like the theme of a fictional text. Mind blown, right? So, central idea of an informational text is a lot like the theme of a fictional text. So think about that for a second. A theme is a life lesson learned that we take from a piece of fiction. So you read a story, you read a book, you watch a movie, you watch a TV show, and you come out with a lesson that's supposed to be learned from that text. Similarly, the central idea is kind of like the main message or the main point that comes out of a text. So usually when we're talking about informational text, works of nonfiction, we talk about them having a central idea. And when we're talking about fictional texts, we talk about them having a theme, but those are very similar. Something else to think about is we've talked about how sometimes a piece of writing might have multiple themes. For example, if I read, or if, let's say I watch the movie The Lion King, or you watch the movie The Lion King, and I say to you, what's the theme of The Lion King? You might say, well, there's a few important themes in The Lion King, and you give me a few examples. Because in a whole long movie, there's probably going to be more than one life lesson. The same can be said for an informational text. If you read a book about the life of Martin Luther King Jr., you're probably going to come out with more than one central idea from an entire book. But when we look at smaller works, like a short article or a short story, you might just find one or two themes or central ideas. So keep that in mind. All right, so steps to finding central idea. The first step is what we talked about last week with Mrs. Tosh, and that's basically looking at all those basic text features, looking at headings, looking at the first and last lines of the text, looking at if there are any subtitles or subheadings. Is there a little blurb at the beginning? Those are all really good clues. Then you're, of course, going to actually read the article closely. That's super important. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to pay attention to what is the structure of the text. And when I say structure, I'm talking about how something is built. Just like if I asked you, what is the structure of your house, you might describe to me how it's organized and how it's built. That's what I want to know when you talk about the structure of a text. How is it organized and built? I think a lot of you in elementary school probably learned with your teachers about a few common text structures. For example, compare contrast, or problem solution, or chronological order. So paying attention to text structure can help you get a sense of what the article's really trying to teach you. For example, if I read an article and it talked about different herbs that can grow in your garden and how to make them survive by giving them the right amount of water. It's kind of like a cause and effect structure. If you do this to this herb, this is what happens. If you do this to this herb, this is what happens. So under central idea, I might say something like, the central idea of this text is that different herbs that you grow require different types of care. And I use that structure to help me get there. So we'll practice that in a minute. Last of all is just to remember to focus on the big ideas and not the specific details, even if the specific details are really interesting. For example, if I read an article about birds and their different speeds, and the article says that an ostrich runs at 100 miles per hour, that's a really interesting detail, but it's not the main idea. The main idea might be something like, this article examines the different speeds at which birds move and explains why some birds are faster than others. That's a more general idea than saying this article is about the fact that the ostrich runs 100 miles per hour. That's not the main idea, okay? So focus on the big ideas, not the little specifics. So to practice today, we have an article called Michaela Triumphant, and it's shared with you in Google Classroom. It's actually kind of a longer document. You're not really going to read the whole thing. You're just going to go down until you find the article Michaela Triumphant, and it starts with this picture at the top. So I'm actually going to ask you to pause right now to read that article, and then once you've read it, come back and I'll be ready to talk to you again. Okay, hopefully you paused and you read the article. So now we're going to follow the steps that we talked about. So step one is that we're going to pay attention to the, oops, hold on one second. Okay, we're going to examine the text features of this article. So we'll start with what's the title of the article. And the title of this article is Michaela Triumphant. And the big idea from this title is that we have a girl named Michaela who is triumphant, so who overcomes challenges. So just by the title alone, we know we're going to have a girl who overcomes challenges. That's a big part of this whole central idea. The subheadings in the article are life in the orphanage and a new life. And those subheadings actually also help us. They give us a general idea of the structure of the text, of how it's moving and what's going to be the important components of it. So all this information will help us when we're trying to figure out the overall central idea of the text. Then we're going to think about the structure. How is this text structured? So like I mentioned earlier, we've learned about a few different text structures. For example, compare contrast, problem solution, chronological, statement support. These are all examples of text structures. There's more than just this list, and sometimes you'll read an article that has more than one structure, and that's okay. But let's think about this article that we just read. So one way to help figure out structure is to look at the beginnings of some of the key paragraphs in the text. So if we look at those, I noticed something about them. So here's 5 kind of intros into different sections of this text. It starts with Civil War raged Sierra Leone from 1991 to 2002. Then we have after her mother died. Then through it all. Then in 1999. Then today. I noticed that a lot of these words have to do with time. I have years, I have today, I have after. So I'm starting to think that this structure of this text is chronological. And now, what does that have to do with the central idea? It probably is going to help me to figure out why the article might have written, why the author might have written this text. And I'm guessing the author wanted us to see how Michaela's situation has changed and developed over time. And that's really important because when I'm talking about the central idea, I probably want to focus on how Michaela has changed or how her life has become different over time. So paying attention to that structure can be really a useful tool. So at this point, this is where we put it all together. We look at the things we found. We've got our title, Michaela Triumphant. We've got our subheadings, a new life, life in the orphanage. We've got our structure, it's chronological. If I put these together into a sentence, I might be able to express the central idea of the text. For example, I might say something like, the central idea of Michaela Triumphant is that a young girl experiences challenges and eventually succeeds thanks to the support of her family. So I kind of go into these little details we got and put them together to make a single sentence statement about the central idea. So let's say you're in a multiple choice scenario and you have a question. I gotta move my face here. You have a question like this, and it says, what is the central idea of the article Michaela Triumphant? Let's look at our choices. So choice A says, the war in Sierra Leone severely affected its citizens. That's true, that did happen. However, I wouldn't say it's the main focus of this article. This article is called Michaela Triumphant, and that's more about the war in the nation of Sierra Leone. So that I would probably eliminate. Then we have choice B. A girl from Sierra Leone was featured in Dancing with the Stars. Now, that's a cool fact, but it's way too specific. It's just one little specific detail from the article. It's not comprehensive enough. So I would get rid of that. The same is true of choice D, where it says a girl in an orphanage was called the devil child. Yes, that's an important detail, but it's a very specific one. So it's not the main message of the text. Choice C, an orphan girl overcame difficulties to achieve her dreams. There we have a more comprehensive, overarching statement of the main purpose of the text, the main message. Now, sometimes you might also be asked in a question to tell the central idea of a certain part of the text. So for example, you might have a question like this: what is the central idea of the section Life in the Orphanage? So now we're thinking about that specific section we read. And you might have to go back to it and reread it. You can pause it and do that now. You're more than welcome to. So the central idea of that section. And I look at choice A. It says Michaela was the favorite child at the orphanage. And I know that's wrong because the text says the opposite of that. So I'm definitely not going to choose that one. Then we have there are thousands of orphans in Sierra Leone. That's, again, might be a true fact, but it's not the main purpose of that section. It's not the main message there. Choice C says orphanages don't provide much love for children. Now, in this situation, in this reading, the orphanage doesn't provide a lot of love for children, but that doesn't mean that all orphanages are not loving. So choice C is actually too big. It's sort of making a big statement that's not true of everybody. So hopefully we're right with D. So D, Michaela experienced many difficulties as an orphan. Yeah, that's true. She did. And that's what that section is about. So that's our central idea of the section Life in the Orphanage. Let's try it again with the next section. So we can look at also what's the central idea of the section called A New Life. We have being adopted helped Michaela achieve her goals. That sounds like it could be a keeper. B, Michaela was able to join the dance theater of Harlem. That's, again, too specific. It doesn't really it's one unique detail from a whole section. It's not general enough. So I'm going to get rid of that one. Then C, Michaela was very sick after she was adopted. Again, that's a little too specific. It's just one moment instead of that whole section. And then last of all, being adopted was a difficult journey for Michaela. That sounds like it could work. So now I'm between A and D, and they're very similar. However, I think the best answer here is going to be A because it talks about how Michaela achieved her goals and not just that it was difficult. So although, yes, it was a difficult journey, ultimately the article is about how she achieves her goals. So A is our best choice here. Now, if you'd like to practice your skills with finding the central idea, I have a Kahoot that you can use to practice. So if you just go to Google Classroom, you'll see it posted for you and you can practice it as many times as you like. The Kahoot doesn't have to do with this particular article. It's just got some little like short paragraphs, and you'll read the paragraph and then try and figure out what statement best shows the central idea of that paragraph. When you do it, make sure you're being careful not to choose just one fact from the paragraph, but choose the overarching idea, the idea of the whole message. Last of all, if you're interested in learning more about Michaela, she's a pretty awesome person, and so I posted in the slide presentation some different resources you can check out. Her website, and then her TED Talk, and then a couple videos, I think one of her dancing, and then one of an interview. So she's really cool, and she actually, I'm pretty certain the parents who adopted her live in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. So I think she's kind of local to this area, which is extra neat. So check it out, learn something new. If you have any questions or concerns, just reach out. And then on Wednesday, you'll have office hours with Mrs. Tosh if you need anything then. I hope you're having a great week, and I look forward to chatting with you guys again soon. Bye.